Great Britain is a premium wine producing region with around 650 vineyards in England and Wales, covering some 2,750 hectares and producing sparkling and still wines. English and Welsh wine have won many prestigious awards recently, and Stephen Skelton is one of the leading authorities on the wines of the UK, who has been working in those vineyards for more than 30 years. The Wines of Great Britain is a comprehensive survey of the history of the UK wines, as well as the current state of the wine industry and its future prospects. The Wines of Great Britain takes us on a tour of contemporary viticulture and winemaking, examining trends in planting and vineyard layout, varieties, rootstocks and clones, vineyard size, modern wineries and styles of wine. With Stephen, we start off discussing how the wines of England have changed over the years since he started his first vineyard in the 1970s. What are the risks of planting vineyards in England? Why 2003 was such a turning point for the English wines? And since then, how it changed the view of English wine, making it a truly world-class region. Also talk about chalk or not to chalk. Hi, I'm Mattias Carpazza, and this is the Looking Into Wine podcast. Wine and winemaking can be complex, but this podcast has a simple mission. We want to give you the skills and tools to harness your passion about wine. Through this series, we will shine a spotlight on some of the different regions, process, and concepts that shape the fascinating world of wine. I hope you enjoy the show and your own journey looking into wine. Welcome to Looking Into Wine. Today's guest is Stephen Skelton, author of The Wines of Great Britain. Welcome to the show, Stephen.
Good to meet you.
So, Stephen, your career in English wine spans from the 70s to the latest book in the 2019. There's almost 50 years of writing and doing works with English wine. I must admit, this is one of the few regions I wanted to specialize, and it's so nice to meet you now.
Right, well, it's good to meet you too.
So your first wineries was actually your first project was in 1977. English vineyards and everything was very different. The most interesting, your first book was in 1989, called The Vineyards of England. What was different to speaking about English wine then?
Well, I mean, 89 was, I started looking into this in 1973, 74. That's when I first got interested. So by 89, I'd already done 15 years, as it were, and so I just felt there wasn't an up-to-date guide to the English vineyards of the time. There had been some books written through those sort of early years. I mean, there's been books about English wine going back for a long, long while. Certainly for the modern era, there were three or four before I wrote that one. But the industry had expanded quite a lot, and I felt there was a need to have something which recorded and which I had sold the vineyard by then, so I was trying to make my way as a writer. I thought I could do wine writing in the summer and winemaking in the winter, but then I soon realized there wasn't much money in wine writing, and so I decided to publish this book, self-publish it, which in those days was not the easy. And you actually had to go to a printer and get typesetters involved, and so do it the hard way. But I had 5,000 books printed. We managed to sell most of them. I don't think I made a lot of money out of it, but it got my name, around, and I enjoyed doing it.
Fantastic. And what sort of style were back then? Because English wine have changed so much over the last 20, 25 years.
Well, it was pretty much all still wine, of course. There was a little bit of sparkling, but not very much. We had 82 and 83 were very big years. And in 83, Taylor started making sparkling wine. So there were a few around. But of course, it was nothing like it is today. I mean, Lambhurst, Newhall, Lambhurst, and a few others started to make sparkling wine. This was before Nightimber. Newhall was growing Chardonnay, Pinot Blanc, and Pinot Noir, and had been for quite a few years. Newhall up in Essex. So I was working at Lambhurst at the time. By this time, I joined Lambhurst in 88, I think it was, and did 3 years there. I inherited a sparkling wine from the previous winemaker.
Yes, as I was reading through your book, there is a lot of the contemporary history, and it's nice to see it and hear you reading your stories through the pages about the influence and everything. And
There's a lot more. There's a lot more stories to come.
oh, that sounds good. And I'm going to ask about that later to see what is happening. So when Nightingale did the first sparkling, officially like the first vineyard to be producing sparkling wine, what did you think?
Well, they weren't the first. They weren't the first at all. No, this is a complete misnomer. What they were was the first large-scale vineyard to specialize in sparkling wine and growing the champagne varieties. So that is what they did. You know, they didn't have still wine. They didn't have any other varieties apart from the three classic champagne varieties. But other people had made sparkling wine. Quite a few other people had made sparkling wine, including wine from Pinot and Chardonnay. So I mean, New Hall had Pinot and Chardonnay wine some while before Nightingale.
Okay, and obviously them being the largest or the first large winery to believe in the sparkling wine of England, obviously they have not started, but they put the English sparkling wine on the map.
Yes, I mean they were large. You know, they had there was plenty of investment there. They were prepared to wait. You know, it was in '92. I think they got released in '96 or '97. So it was already, you know, it had 3 or 4 years on the lees. So they were prepared to wait to get the product right. And of course, it came out and immediately won major prizes.
Yes, and then it was interesting when I was reading in the from the 70 to the 90 early 90s the growth of planting, and then there was a switch in 94 to the French varieties to that with like Stuart.
Well, no, the switch didn't happen really till 2003.
Okay.
The viticulture area was on decline at that point. You know, through the 90s and the early 2000s, you know, the vineyards were declining in size because people were taking them out. And it wasn't really in 2003, which was a very, very warm year, that everyone sort of said, oh, it's too hot to grow grapes in Champagne. We need to go to England. So that was really when the planting took off. 04 was the first uptick in the plantings.
I was reading, and there was then it was
since 04, it's been nothing but, you know, plant.
And obviously, you've been involved as a viticulturist in a part of it. And was it then? Then now a lot of people talks about the English sparkling wines and the presence of the white chalk. How important is the white chalk? And there's a couple of points in your book that you refer about it.
Well, I don't think it's as important as people think. You know, we're seeing good wines made from chalk. We're seeing good wines made from other soils as well. I think you have to understand what chalk brings to a vineyard. I'm not sure that we need to retain the acidity in the same way as the Champenoise do. I personally, you know, I would personally rather have a very well sheltered, warm site not on chalk, on chalk but was rather windy and rather exposed. If you can get both, you know, that's fine. But a lot of this chalk downland is rather exposed and at altitude. You know, anything much above 100 and 125 meters, I think is getting up there.
As I was reading in your book, that there's a lot of this debate between altitude and no shelter or sheltered and warmer.
Well, I don't think there's much debate. I don't think there's much debate about it. We've got the facts. We've got the figures to show that, you know, the higher you go, the lower your yield, and which is obvious. You know, you get cooler as you go further north, further up. You know, high in altitude. But it's some people like the idea of having chalk. It reads well. It looks well on the back label. They can talk about it being like champagne. So, you know, from the PR point of view. But remember, Nightingale's first vintages weren't off chalk at all. You know, Gusbourne's first vintages, no chalk whatsoever. So there's been plenty of people who have made good sparkling wine not on chalk and will continue to do so.
It's something that's good for the marketing, but it may not, of course, be the key for English wine. And there is this wind is quite interesting. Why is wind such a strong influence in England when I was at a part of only like?
Well, because we're a maritime climate. You know, you can't get more than 65 miles away from the sea in the UK. You know, we're a maritime climate. for a continental climate, then it's you have much warmer summers, but much cooler winters. But that's not, I know we have a lot of Atlantic weather comes from across the Atlantic, and most of the warmer sites are in the south of England, which is exposed to the Atlantic.
And obviously the wind is fairly strong in reducing the yield.
Well, yeah, but this is the same. This is. I don't know if you've been to New Zealand. It's the same there. It's in Australia as well. In parts of Australia, they get a lot of wind that blows across, and windbreaks are part and parcel of growing any type of fruit, and have always been in UK.
I mean, yes, of course, and there is also the fact that a lot of producers, and they talk about the low yielding of their vineyard. But then I was reading on the book, there's a lot of vigorous soils, and I was trying to think why they have such a low yielding.
Well, the low yield comes from the climate. You can't, the viability of a fruit bud is to do with the amount of heat it receives. The further south you go, the bigger the yields. You look at apples, for instance. You only have to go to Belgium, Holland, northern Germany, which is a little bit further south than us, but their apple yields are much more than our yields in the UK. And it's the same with vines. It's physics. It's botany. You can't escape it. In some years, we have good yields. 2018 was a very good year, but last year or this year, 2020, probably average. Not large by the last, not as large as compared to 18 and 19, but
there is a lot of vintage variation in the English wine.
Well, there's the vine. Most fruit crops have at least 30% vintage variation. Apples, pears, plums, all fruit crops have vintage variation. It's not like cereals where you have much the same crop year in year out, or even that. But with vines, with vines, it varies more than most fruit crops. And in the UK, we can go from 2012 was 5.6 or 5.7 hectolitres per hectare. 2018 was 45. So that's there's a massive variation.
Wow,
that's to do with frost, bad weather, flowering. There's lots of factors which can bring the crops down.
And there's a quite delicate ecosystem in England and compared to other regions in Europe. And obviously in 2003 was a switch, and that meant that a lot of investment came from the Champagne regions, people thinking about England.
Yeah, that didn't happen till a bit later. Tattinger didn't start looking until 13, I think it was 2013. There had been others before that, but certainly there had been interest expressed by Champenoise before then, but it didn't actually come to anything. With Duval-Leroy, quieter, I think in about 2005, I think they started looking
for the first vineyard. So, in your opinion, as a viticulturist, what are the benefit of growing vines that are unique in growing vines in Great Britain? Well, I
wouldn't say there were many benefits. It's a challenge. No, it's a challenge. The benefit is we have a population of 60 million. We normally have a big tourist business, visitor business, many of whom come from wine growing regions. So we have customers on our doorstep. That's the biggest advantage, I would say. But from a viticultural point of view, no, it's a disadvantage growing vines here. Unless you want to make English wine, which you can't make in France or Germany or anywhere else.
Yes, of course. And there's still
it's challenging growing grapes in the UK because of the climate. It is improving, so it is getting better and easier, and crops are getting larger. The last 2-3 years have been about, well, I say this year was probably around average. It's probably a little bit above average, actually. But 18 and 19 were definitely above average.
About 65% of the production is sparkling.
Well, it varies from year to year. You see a lot of people this year, some people this year, I should say, didn't make sparkling because they've got so much already made. They've made still wine because the conditions were much better for still.
Okay.
So, it's not a fixed percentage. A lot of people have made still Chardonnay this year who've never made still wine before.
Okay, so there is a bit of shift to still wines and.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Do you think we're going to see more non-vintage English wine? Because there's a lot of vintage English, but non-vintage is a bit more, not rarer, but it's a bit difficult.
Why would you make non-vintage which sells at a lower price when you can make vintage which sells at a higher price?
Fair enough.
Tattinger are going to make a non-vintage for their first release. So we were having to wait 3 extra years. To make a non-vintage, you need to have 3 extra vintages. Whereas if you make a vintage, you can make a vintage with your first small harvest.
Is it more related to the quantity than you can produce as well? And the vineyards, the wineries are relatively small. You only have a few large operations still in England, and I think it's quite interesting also to see a different part of England and the different producer.
No, I think the idea of non-vintage is to spread the risks of years over different vintages, to spread the risk of different regions. I mean, Champagne is basically a non-vintage, non-varietal, non-site specific wine. Well, we rather like having vintages. We think that gives much more interest to the public who want to buy our wines. And in some years you get Blanc de Blanc that does better, or some years it's Rosé, or some years it's classic Cuvée. And if you say, right, to start with, we're just going to make non-vintage, then your offering to the public is pretty wine. That's it. So I think people, the Champagne model has been brought about for historical reasons, and I think that model is actually breaking down.
Well, yeah, you can see more vintage in Champagne as well, more vintage Champagne.
There's more small growers coming out, not smaller producers producing their own wines. I think things are changing. For the big volume Grand Marques, yes, non-vintage will have to be the mainstay because it's where their volume is and it's where they can get the price down. But for us, that's not so important.
They're still quite small, and what grape do you think are they going to be more planting in for the English wine? Obviously.
Well, I don't see it changing much. It hasn't changed to be honest, apart from Pinot and Chardonnay, it hasn't really changed much in all the time I've been involved. Müller-Thurgau is gone. Okay, that's the only really big change. But we've still got Sauvignon Blanc, Reichensteiner, Bacchus, plus Meunier, Pinot Noir, and Chardonnay. I think Pinot Noir and Chardonnay will be even more dominant in years to come. I think there could be, I know that people are planting Reichensteiner, Céval for Charmat method wines. There's interest in Charmat method, which could be something. But when you look there's 1,000 hectares each of Pinot and Chardonnay. So out of the 3,500, 2 varieties account for over 60-something% of it. So that's not going to disappear very quickly.
No, absolutely. I mean, and it's interesting, like how in the book I was reading about the shift from the German varieties to the French varieties, and there was an interesting point happening. I believe it was in the late 80s, and why did it?
Well, I mean, there was a shift in wine, in wine styles. I mean, that's really why the German varieties fell out of favor, because people didn't really want to buy those anymore. This is before sparkling. Varieties that people couldn't pronounce and made German style wines. We started getting New Zealand, Australia, South America, South Africa, eventually Australia wines. Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Sauvignon Blanc, and so forth. And those are the sort of wines that people wanted.
And of course, that was the pressure for the producer to produce what people want. So that's always the challenge for everybody.
Things like, I mean, the big brands were Hock, Mosel, Golden October, Blue Nun, Black Tower, Lutimer Riesling, Yugoslavian wines. They were the big sellers in my day, in the early 70s, 80s. But it all disappeared around about the end of the 80s. All those wines caught a cold, and then today they're virtually non-existent on the market. If you say to people what a Mosel, people don't know what Mosel wine is.
It's difficult to find this grape, and people know what they like.
In the supermarket, I don't think you'll find a Mosel wine. Whereas, Deinhardt's Green Label used to be one of the standard wines. You'd find it on every restaurant list. Blue Nun and Deinhardt's Green Label Mosel wine were on every wine list in every restaurant, hotel, but now they're gone.
Now they're gone. Oh, well, there's still people looking for them out there, and they are very interesting wines indeed. And
for high-end stuff, yeah. I mean, you can find it. Specialist wine merchants have it, yes, but not on our supermarket shelf.
You were mentioning Bacchus grape, which is considered the English call for Sauvignon Blanc. Well, why is that, and why has it become so popular?
Well, we can't grow Sauvignon Blanc really, so and it's a popular style. I think it just happened that it was planted in the I think the late 70s, where there was a little experimental vineyard at Y College near Canterbury, and it was one of about 10 varieties that the Germans sent over for us to try. When I was at Geisenheim, I looked at it, I tasted it. I was given, it was one of the varieties which was in the frame for me to plant. And I tasted it and was told that unless it got to a certain sugar level, it wouldn't be any good. And we were never going to get to that sugar level. So I decided not to plant it. But I think it was New Hall was the first vineyard to plant it. And it's done quite well in tastings. It stands out in a crowd. We've got used to making it well, and it does perform well. Very, very good.
Indeed, there's a lot of yes, there's a young industry still, and there is a lot. I mean,
Yeah.
although the planting has been going on since the 1950s, the first commercial, the changes happened in the last 15 years, and so much is changing. The grape varieties that they've been planting. Also, I was reading in the trellising systems they've been changing from like big vines to.
Well, yeah, that hasn't changed a huge amount. There was a bit of Geneva double curtain in the early days, but it never really got to. I mean, I don't know the percentages, but I don't suppose it was much more than 20% of the area. It may not even been that much. Most people grew on Geo systems. I mean, rows have got narrower, densities have got higher. So people are there is now a fairly accepted sort of 2 meter row width, 1 meter, 1.2 meters in the row. So a fairly standard density. I mean, pretty well all the French champagne plantings are at 2x1. And I would say that's what I started to plant at when I came back from Germany. It's what I learned in Geisenheim. So I've never deviated from that. Well, 2x1.2 was what I started at. It's a good compromise between having to have enjambeurs, overhead tractors, and wider road tractors. We need narrower rows. Really, higher density is much better in our climate.
Yes, of course, the rainforest is a difference between other regions. Obviously, in England, rains much more than other countries in Europe.
Well, yeah, it doesn't. We're about the same as Bordeaux. But the thing is that we have more rainfall in the summer than Bordeaux. That is one of the problems again, because we're more of a maritime climate, although Bordeaux is fairly maritime, but it's a bit further inland.
It's more sheltered,
and it's warmer, of course.
And obviously, the global warming is making a difference. And I know that. Do you think we will see more? Because I know it's quite something English wine they're not.
Yeah, winemakers like barrels, don't they?
Yeah, they will start using it, and why not? It's good to see. It's a good examples. Obviously, of course, England.
I think when it's done properly, yeah, it helps. But I don't. I think one of the things is we have a huge purity of fruit. So if you're putting it in barrel, you perhaps lose some of that. But it's a talking point, a point of difference. A lot of people like to ferment some of their blends in oak. Yeah, I think I was one of the first people to have oak barrels in I think 1990. I think I bought my first 12 barrels from Cigar Moro. Was it 12 or was it 6? I can't remember now. Yeah, it was me and Lamberhurst who both had oak barrels. We didn't know how to use them really, but it was a talking point. And I made won the prize for the best wine of the year, so I was doing something right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you think about standard now, 12 barrels at any small winery almost have them.
Yeah, well, they were jolly expensive as well. I can't remember how much, but I know they were a lot of money.
Well, definitely England is changing, and it's changing quite quickly. There's a lot of people coming from abroad. I was reading on the book also from other states, which not from France, but also other Germany and American people coming over. Where are they looking? What area do you think as a viticulturist?
Well, I don't know. There's the amount of foreign money coming in is not vast. It's mainly homegrown. I mean, you've got 2 champagne houses invested. I mean, the trouble is they come over here from if you're growing grapes in France or Italy or wherever, and you start looking into the UK viticulture, you can't believe how low the yields are. So if you got your own business and you're basing it on 60, 80 hectoliters per hectare, and you suddenly come here and find the yields are only 30 or 40, you have to ask yourself, well, how can I make any money out of it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of wineries, you were saying, or vineyards, that they don't produce enough to be commercially successful in England, and we have to see what happened to them. And there was some interesting figures on your book about how many hectares of vineyards have been lost, or wineries since you started, and they've changed.
Yeah, I mean we still have a lot of vineyards which struggle to get reasonable yields. But that's unfortunately that is something which people will plant on sites that they already own, or sites that they think will do well, don't take proper advice, or all kinds of reasons why they plant, and they get by with the yields they get. But these are not sustainable yields. They're not yields that will see the vineyards lasting for decades.
Yeah, I think you're saying is site selection is vital for England for sure.
It is, yeah.
And there's a lot of research is done. What are the best? Okay, well, Stephen, I mean, English wine is so new, and this is so interesting for me to understand what's happening at the moment, about a bit of the history, and I think we cover a lot of it. And I love the idea that English wine are going to produce more wine and better quality. We're going to see more still and more sparkling wine produced, and I think it's going to be very exciting to follow. And,
I wish I was 28 again, because I think the next 40 years will be very interesting.
I'll keep looking on English wine for sure.
Yeah, you
and thank you so much for your time, Stephen.
Okay.
Thank you for joining me today.
Goodbye.
You have listened to the Looking into Wine podcast with Stephen Skelton, Master of Wine, on the history of English wine and to these latest trends. The next episode will be with the vineyard manager of Hambledon Vineyards, discussing viticulture in England, and at Hambledon, the oldest commercial winery in the UK, in Hampshire. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider subscribe and to leave a review. And don't forget to tell your friends about the podcast.
Charles didn't have just any coronary artery disease. He had Charles's coronary artery disease. Michelle didn't have just any heart attack. She had Michelle's heart attack. At VCU Health Poly Heart Center, we know every heart is unique. And as Virginia's only nationally ranked heart program, we'll keep them beating healthy and strong. VCU Health Poly Heart Center. Learn more at vcuhealth.org/heart.